Welcome to our next lesson where we will implement support for token-based authentication using JSON Web Tokens. In this lesson, we will deviate slightly from ASP.NET Core Identity because it doesn't actually support JSON Web Tokens. We will have to implement this support ourselves. However, we will use Identity for the supporting functionality that's required to implement authentication and login inside of our API. As I mentioned in one of our first lessons in this chapter, using JSON Web Tokens allows us to respect the stateless constraint for our REST API that says that our application requests should be stateless. They should contain enough information for us to process it, and this should also include authentication. By using a JSON Web Token, we can append an opaque value to our incoming requests and use this value to authenticate the current user and also extract some useful contextual information from the JSON Web Token itself. So let's go into the code and let me show you how we are going to implement this. We have to start by installing an additional NuGet package that will let us work with JSON Web Tokens for authentication inside of our API, but also for creating them to return them to our API clients. If I look for JWT Bearer, I will find the NuGet package that I'm looking for, which is Microsoft ASP.NET Core Authentication JWT Bearer. Let's go ahead and install the latest version, and then we can close down the NuGet window. Inside of the dependency injection class, I want to register the services that I will need to support JSON Web Token authentication. After registering the identity services, I will say builder services add authentication. And here I can pass in the default authentication scheme, which I can access using the JWT Bearer defaults class and pass in the bearer authentication scheme. This is what we will be using to authenticate with our API. And then if I call add JWT Bearer, I can configure the JSON Web Token options, which allows me to determine how to validate my JSON Web Token. What I want to do here is access the token validation parameters, initialize a new instance, and then I can set a couple of the properties that I will need to validate my JSON Web Token. Now, because I preferred having my settings strongly typed, let's go ahead and create an object that will encapsulate these values. Let me create a settings folder inside of my application root, and inside of it I will add a new class that I will call the JWT of options. Then let me paste in the content of this type, and here I want to be able to set the issuer, the audience, the key that we will use for signing the JSON Web Token, and the token expiration in minutes. Let me paste in the implementation, and this is what I want to configure on this object. I want to be able to set the valid issuer, the valid audience, the key that will be used for signing the JSON Web Token, the token expiration time in minutes, and the refresh token expiration time in days. This property will be required for our next lesson, but I think it's worth creating it right now. Now let's go into our app settings development JSON file, and I'll create this section here that will contain the respective values. So we have our key, our issuer, our audience, the expiration time in minutes, and the refresh token expiration in days. These are some sensible default values that I will use for development. In production, you may want to reduce the token expiration time to something very short, like 5 minutes, something like that should be sufficient. And it's also important that you don't commit the JSON Web Token signing key into your source control. You want to provide this either through some secret manager like Azure Key Vault, or properly set it as an application secret. When working in a local development environment and you want to use a real value, then you can right-click your project and head over to Manage User Secrets. Here you can add any configuration value that you don't want to place inside of your application settings to avoid committing it to your source control. So for example, I could create a value here that says JWT key and then assign the actual secret value. Now I will omit this because I'm just using some dummy key value inside of my app settings, and it's obvious that something like this won't be used in production, so it's safe to keep it in source control. Now let's go back to our dependency injection setup. Here I want to do two things. Register my options object with dependency injection by saying builder services configure, specify the type, and then I need to provide a configuration section that will contain this value. So I will say builder configuration, get section, and the section name is JWT. But then I also need this object locally, and you can do this by saying builder configuration get section, pass in the section name, and then you can materialize this into an object. So I will use this to get a JWT of options instance. So now I can finally set the valid issuer here to the value that's coming from my off options. I will use a null forgiving operator here, although a better solution would probably be to use a guard clause to make sure that this object isn't null. Let's also set the valid audience to the value that I have here, and then the issuer signing key will be a new symmetric security key, and I will say encoding UTF-8 get bytes and convert the key value that I'm getting from my application settings into an array of bytes. Finally, I also want to add authorization services while we are still configuring everything so that we don't forget it later when we need to implement support for authorization in our API. We are already calling this method from the program file, so there's nothing left to do in that regard, and that would be a good time to include the authentication and authorization middleware. So I'll first add the authentication middleware, and then I will include the authorization middleware as part of my request pipeline. The order of this middleware is important, so you want to make sure to first include authentication and then authorization. So now that we have this initial setup, let's create a service that will take care of creating the JSON Web Token. I'll create it in the services folder, and I will call this the token provider. Let me close down the app settings and the program file and my JWT of options, and let's continue with the token provider. So here I want to inject an iOptions object, specify JWT of options as the value, and I'm going to store this in a private read-only field. Let's call it JWT of options, and I'm going to assign this value from the options value property. Then I'll create a simple record that's going to represent a request for creating a new access token. And here I want to include the user's identifier that will be part of the access token and the user's email that I can add as a claim. Now, what are we going to return when we create an access token? For example, I can return a record. Let's call it access tokens DTO. And here I can include the access token value and the refresh token value. Now, for the time being, I won't create the refresh token. I'm just including it for our next lesson where we are going to talk about implementing this. Now, let's expose a method here that's going to return an access tokens DTO, and I can just name it create. It's going to accept a token request as an argument. Let's actually call it by its full name, token request. And what we want to do here is simply return a new access tokens DTO instance. So right now we don't have these values, but I will create some helper methods inside that will create the access token and the refresh token. So let's call this method generate access token. From the arguments, we will need the token request object. And for now, let's return an empty string. And then I will need another method here called generate refresh token, and for this we won't need any arguments. I'll just return an empty string. What I want to do is simply call these methods when generating my access tokens DTO to split the responsibility for creating an access token from creating a refresh token. And finally, let's see what we need to do to generate an access token. I'll need to create a new symmetric security key. So let me initialize this object, and it accepts an array of bytes representing our security key. We can get this using encoding UTF-8 get bytes, and I will pass in the key value from my options object. Then I will need my signing credentials, where the argument is the security key, and I will specify which algorithm I want to use for signing the key. This will be HMAC SHA-256. Then I want to initialize a list of claims that I will include as part of my access token. I can use the collection expression syntax to initialize this list, and let's initialize our first claim. I will use some constants from the Microsoft Identity JSON Web Tokens namespace, and I want to include the subject claim as the first value, and this will come from the token request where I have the user ID. Because this is already a list of claims, I can omit it from the constructor, and then let's specify our next claim, which is going to be the email claim, and I'll specify the respective value from my token request. Then I need to create a new token descriptor. This will be a new security token descriptor, and here I need to set a couple of properties. The first one is our claims identity, where I will just pass in the list of claims that we created. Later we can extend this to support additional claims, for example, when we need to implement support for role-based authorization. Then let's set the expiration time using our options object, where we have the expiration in minutes property. I will set the signing credentials, the issuer, and the audience, which are all values that I have available. Then I'm going to initialize a new handler, and I will use the JSON Web Token Handler type. This type exposes a simple method that allows me to get back an access token, and I just need to call create token and pass in the token descriptor. Now I can reasonably expect that this value will not be null, and I can return it as the result of this method. So now that we have the token provider, let's move around these types a little. I will move the